Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again on The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Jason Baxter. His new book is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, which will be released on the 15th. Jason's the author of several other books, including Dante's Encyclopedia and the Names of God, and A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy. You know, C.S. Lewis is a beloved figure to most of us, and generally that's because of his Narnia books, notwithstanding Tolkien's disdain, as well as his science fiction trilogy, which I loved when I was a kid, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. But we also may know him from his other works, A Grief Observed, which is a book I give anyone who's suffered a loss, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, which I just read again last night, getting ready for this, which is always fun to read, The Great Divorce, Until We Have Faces. But what we didn't know, and I didn't know, was the scholarly and passionate interest that Lewis had with the medieval, Dante, Boethius, which I would love to talk about. And it's just not something that it's strange to think of the medieval, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages as a time of enlightenment, if you will, for Lewis. But it was, and Jason's going to tell us why. So hi, Jason, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks. So good to be here. So grateful to be here.
So what is the deal? I mean, when we think of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval times, people think of that as gray, dark, people huddled around fires, cauldrons. And then when we think of the Renaissance, we have this beautiful chiaroscuro and beautiful colors, and Michelangelo and Leonardo. So people, when you read the title of the book, you wonder, okay, here's this guy that was modern. He helped create modernity with regard to literature. How is it that he got so imbued with this, the idea of the medieval?
Yeah, with a couple of great places to go in Lewis to read about that. One is his inaugural address that he gave in 1954 when Cambridge created a special academic chair just for him. They lured him away from Oxford and they gave him the chair of medieval and Renaissance studies. And he loved that idea because he thought that was, trying to very proactively erase the dividing line between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And that lecture is all about, well, if it's not between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where is the great divide of history? But this is something consistent in Lewis. Also in his scholarly book, English Literature in the 16th Century, his introduction to that book is called New Learning and New Ignorance, which he also takes on this idea. So he himself is seemingly not entirely certain about the origins of the whole concept of the Dark Ages. He thinks it might be a little bit of humanist propaganda, he calls it at one point. The 15th century humanist boasting about how excellent their poetry was, but it was a poetry that was doing different things and thus had become blind to some of the excellences of the Middle Ages. But their propaganda, their own advertising campaign was so successful that we forgot about the beauties of the Middle Ages. And Lewis even says that one of his students once, who had spent years reading really excellent, complicated poetry, Lewis says that as complicated as a medieval cathedral or as beautiful as an ancient ornate garden, had nevertheless found himself using humanist propaganda or even Enlightenment propaganda, how he described the Middle Ages as being a surging storm of dark emotions. And Lewis makes the point that isn't that remarkable, that even though he had the very experience, the propaganda, the advertisement, the 15th century Enlightenment, later Enlightenment marketing had been so successful that it put a stereotype in his brain such that he couldn't even speak about what he had experienced first person.
I like the way that, I always think Lewis kind of indulged us, not as children, because he thought these children's books were for adults too, and that we should all keep in mind the fact that a child's eyes are probably more valuable than adult's eyes. But then when he wrote about the medieval, he expected you to come to his books with a certain amount of knowledge, or else you weren't really allowed to read them. I love when you talk about that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should just say that what an appropriate thing for the man who's interviewed Katie Camello about the value of children's eyes. And part of the reason I'm excited to be on this interview today is that my children now think that I'm actually a successful human being because I'm on a podcast, which Katie Camello has been on previously. So thanks for helping exalt my reputation in my children's eyes.
Well, and I felt like my stepdaughter, Lorelei, who loves Kate Camilla, I thought last time, I've interviewed her several times. I thought last time I'll just put Lorelei on. And we were both there and Kate said, could you just leave and just leave Lorelei there, please?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I could bring my daughter on as well. But yeah, so I think with Lewis, he saw his scholarly books as a very beautiful metaphor, and really all of his work as a scholar. This is actually, in fact, how I think about my own teaching, as topographical maps, right? With the maps with the contour lines that show the sort of heights of distances. It says, look, you can study those things, and but if you study them really well enough that when you actually start out on a walk, that you don't even take it out, then you're able to enjoy a landscape with what he calls a wise passiveness, and it's enhanced. He says if you're constantly pulling out your map and holding it in front of the landscape, you're not going to be looking at the landscape. You're not going to be traveling through it very well. But if you know those contour lines, then you might come to a part where you say, wait a minute, if I'm not mistaken, over this hill must be a really lovely valley. And then you can go and discover things which you wouldn't have seen if you were just passing through it. That's his metaphor for wise study. Wise study medieval literature, according to Lewis, as opposed to just read it. He says, look, I'm not going to quarrel with anyone if you just want to go read medieval literature and find those sentiments that you wanted to find in the first place, sentiments of romance and adventure and knights. And you can bring your modern experience to the Middle Ages. But Lewis warns, if you do that, it'll kind of like being an Englishman traveling around the continent. You're going to ask for bad tea where you could have had excellent coffee or wine. And thus for Lewis, even his scholarship, even his fact accumulation is never about, passing the exam or having 87 correct opinions. For Lewis, it's always about looking, another metaphor he uses, you look at the beam so that you can get to the point you can look along the beam. You study the contour map so that you can pass through the landscape with an immersive experience. And that seemingly is how he even thought of his lectures. He was always trying to equip his students to get to the point that they could pick up the old books and not be distracted by how difficult and strange they were. But when they got beyond the difficulties and the strangeness by means of the academic lectures, then, and one of my favorite metaphors, then they could start breathing in the atmosphere of the ancient and smelling its smell and tasting its flavor and seeing strange things with new eyes. That's seemingly what he wanted to do as an academic, was try to create those types of reading experiences, make them possible for his students, and then ultimately for his readers.
It's so funny when you're talking about metaphors, some of them seem to almost, there's one quote that I found from him. It says, even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. A self does the same. It's almost quantum physics. It's almost Newtonian or general relativity. It's and it repeats in Narnia, and it repeats in science fiction trilogy. And it's so fascinating that well, let me ask you this. I end up talking too much, but let me ask you this. So, if you look at your web page, at the very top, you say, I write on the relevance of medieval thought as it relates to medieval mysticism, Dante and C.S. Lewis. And you're so enthusiastic and passionate about this. Do you have a medieval mind?
Wow. What a cool question. Okay. How do you know if you have a medieval mind? Lewis says that one of the tests of having a medieval mind, this is the litmus test. This is the quick one. This is the rapid test. Potent metaphor these days.
Yeah,
The rapid test is if you like Boethius. Yep. And if you like the consolation. Now, you can't just like book 1 and book 2. That's pretty easy, I think. Book 1 and book 2 of consolation are pretty good. If you like books 3, book 4, and book 5, you can consider yourself a medieval. So I remember reading something like that by Lewis, in my early 20s. Loved Lewis as a fiction writer, like you. Loved Lewis and his apologetic writing and his sort of pastoral works, as Rowan Williams calls it. And then because of that, had got into some of his nonfiction stuff and read that. And I was all excited to go read Boethius. And I read Boethius, and I don't think I got through book 2. And so I think I failed in my youth. But now I'm a recovering modernist. I sometimes call myself a recovering Cartesian. And I like Boethius. And I think I've finally have begun to get some sort of inclination and intuition of what Boethius is up to. And there's crazy distinctions that he makes between fate and providence and time and eternity. So I think I'm getting there. I think I've entered the narthex of the great cathedral, or maybe one of the side chapels, in terms of possessing a medieval mind.
All I get from Boethius, because I can't get any further than you got when you're a teenager, is this idea of this. It's like this wheel of fortune. Pat Sajak. It's like Lady Fortune.
Pat Sajak ruined it for us, I'm afraid. Yeah.
So it's like he had this wonderful life and a loving son.
Yeah.
He's thrown into prison and later executed. But when he's there, how is he writing this when he's there? And he comes up with this idea that, hey, don't worry about all this stuff, because what comes around goes around. It's not really that important, because up here, you could just and again, that's what's happening in the world today. If you're in the Ukraine, you had a lovely house and a lovely wife and a lovely son, and then one day it's gone. That's as much as I can get out of it.
Yeah, I think it's a tough book for us moderns, The Consolation. But you have to remember that for Boethius, those are just initial arguments.
Right.
As he says, with my students, because at Wyoming Catholic College, my students spend a significant amount of time in the backwoods, so I can use lots of wilderness medicine techniques. But for Boethius, right, books 1 and books 2 is really about just stopping the bleeding. Now, unfortunately, in this kind of great philosophical treatise, Boethius thinks there's going to be some necessary deep medical interventions. There's going to be some surgery. But books 1 and 2 is just that sort of backwoods wilderness intervention, the sort of stuff you learn in a Boy Scout manual, right? But at least that's one of his arguments, that, look, you could have been born in a country of poverty. You could have been born in an age of poverty. These things just sort of shift around. You got to at least let go of the feeling that you were owed this or deserved this, because the reality is most of humanity hasn't received your flourishing and your prosperity. Oh, Boethius, says Lady Philosophy. So that's kind of like step 1, in the medical treatment. Step 2 in the medical treatment is, and this is something that I think we overlook. And I would say if your readers get excited about this, buying my book just for the footnotes on Boethius would be worth the price. Forget the book, just read the footnotes on Boethius, because there's some beautiful things about Boethius being written. But one scholar talks about the consolation of philosophy as a liturgical poetic act, by which he means, and this is hard for us because we're reading it in translation, but Boethius meticulously, like some sort of 6th century Proust, right, creates all these different poetic meters. You remember the text alternates between arguments and poetry, arguments and song. And each one of these songs is written in a different meter, which Boethius thought was calculated to help retune the heart to the symphony of the world. So as Boethius is trying to, with one kind of assault, is trying to help the mind, with the other side, he's trying to warm the heart. And that, for Boethius, prepares him for those deep interventions. That's kind of, deep, scary surgery of books 4 and book 5. But maybe that'll convince you enough to give it a second shot.
Either that or not. It's so funny because that part of it dredged up this memory that I'd forgotten, because in the publicity materials that came with the book, you talked about Corbin Carnell and his correspondence in Bright Shadow of Reality. And I remember I took his course when he was writing Bright Shadow of Reality, and he dedicated it to a lot of people, but one of the people he dedicated it to was me.
Whoa, that's great.
And I had forgotten completely about it. He was a great guy. He was also Jungian, and he told me he would tell everyone what Jungian archetype they were, and he told me I was the trickster, which is like, I don't know whether that's a blessing or a curse.
Well, based on our text exchanges earlier today, I think he must have had a good sense of intuition.
It's worked and it's not worked. You have to hit the right person. If it's the wrong person, it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
And you can peg people really quickly, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to do.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was going to say the other quote was, there's all these quotes, but one of my favorites, again, going to that kind of banter, is the one he goes, there was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it.
Yes. Poor Lewis was unforgiving to poor old Eustace for having, you remember his line, he hadn't read any of the right books.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's so many book quotes, if you read a book, you have to read it again. When you read a new book, then read an old book in between.
Yes.
All that stuff, it resonates with you.
Yes.
You remember it your whole life because it's all, you and I have these libraries behind us.
You do.
And before the interview, I'm pulling this out, looking at this thing.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Right?
Yes. I think Lewis would love that. You're right. He says so many interesting things about books. I think my favorite thing my first favorite thing that he says is in Surprised by Joy, where he describes how books were packed into every shelf and every space of that big old house. And I'm afraid I've inflicted that existence on my children.
And books and food going well together.
Yes. But the other thing I love is that Lewis says that although if we stepped into each other's library and looked at all these strange titles that we've gathered up over a couple of decades, and things even, from periods of our life in which we thought we were doing something new and different, something that was not us, someone who really knew us could discover the secret thumbprint, the secret DNA that exists and it links every book in our library. And I oftentimes look at my library, which is extremely poorly organized.
That's
and
good.
I've moved, enough that I just throw stuff on there just to get it done. And then I have to, call my wife to ask her if she knows where a book is. But just thinking about that, there being some sort of secret link that, in a way, my own story, my own desires, my own hopes, dreams, and fears could be correlated with the secret that brought all the books that I've purchased in the library together. I love that about Lewis.
It's like Borges, and it's like your own genome. And in actuality, it's almost as complicated if you took every letter of every word. It's like Babel.
The Library of Babel. Yeah, every possible permutation of every book that wasn't written. Yeah,
and a book that contains all those books. So I wouldn't bring this in because I figure, I'll stick with the medieval. But you bring in Aslan and you bring in the trilogy, and there's a connection between the two. Talk a little bit about that. Why we know who Aslan was, and that letter he writes back to that girl about when you go back to the real world, find the other name of Aslan. Mm-hmm. So what is it? How does Christianity link the mind of the medieval man with the mind of someone who can write Narnia? Or does it at all?
Yeah. Well, I think the secret is, there are a lot of things that the Middle Ages taught Lewis. One of them is that they taught him how to compose. They taught him how to write. In the Middle Ages, there was a process called imitatio, which we would say imitation. But as soon as we say imitation, then we realize that that has a negative connotation, whereas for them it didn't. Imitatio meant the apprenticeship to a master. It meant sort of absorbing a style, and they even built like this too, right? When they build a new cathedral, they always build it in the old footprint. I mean, so they have a Romanesque building, but then a Gothic building is always in the same footprint. Their writing styles do something similar to that. So Lewis thought that one of the characteristics of modernity was the absolute insistence on creativity, originality, novelty, and individuality, right? If a popular writer, it turned out that he or she had basically stolen a plot, they'd get in big trouble for that, right? They'd be decried as, a plagiarist, a thief, or at least sort of derivative. They can't even come up with their own ideas. But in the medieval understanding of sort of composition, I guess you could think of it as recycling. The Middle Ages are more ecological, right? You could take an old idea, and it wasn't owned by a particular brain. It was, in some sense, it was owned by the cosmos. And if it was a good idea, you could rewrite it. You could recycle it. You could give it a new language. You could give it a new world. So I think that's one of the things that really influenced Lewis, is just, I think it gave him permission as a writer to be a rewriter, to be a recycler, and not to have come up with this independent plot, which was exclusively his. But what he could do is create worlds in which certain ideas could exude a perfume of atmosphere. And I think that medieval idea gave Lewis permission to write his Narnia books, which, as Michael Ward has argued, I think persuasively, are connected in his mind with theological and philosophical associations of old astrology. But so Lewis was able to write these books in which basically he could, like I said, create an atmosphere for certain types of moods, certain types of quests, certain types of desires. I mean, my favorite is, and this is mentioned in my mysticism chapter, is Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because it's the strength of the heart, the fire of the heart, the fervor and ardor of the heart for deep and beautiful things, the quest for the unquenchable thirst for the infinite. That book, I think, in some sense, exists in order to give embodiment to those types of desires of the heart. And Lewis more or less says this in a very fascinating essay called Christianity and Literature. If you read his Discarded Image, and then go read his little essay, Christianity and Literature, you'll see that even when he talks about the composition process of writing, it's sort of filtered down into him through these medieval channels.
Well, it's like almost like an old chestnut. And tell me if this is true. Like with the Inklings, was there a moment when Tolkien convinced Lewis that Christianity was what he should be? He should be a Christian, or is that not true? And when did that happen, and how did that happen?
Seemingly there is. And there's a specific night, and there's a specific weather pattern for it, and there's a specific place. It's Magdalen College, Deer Park. Humphrey Carpenter writes about it in his biography of the Inklings. Or seemingly it's like this, that there was a moment in which Tolkien and a fellow Dyson and Lewis all had this wonderful conversation in which Lewis said this, repeating something he would, let's say, in Surprised by Joy. Everything I believe in, I think, is drab and mechanical and depressing. Everything I love and find inspiring, I don't think it's true. And in his mind, sort of the brain of a modern with the heart of a medieval. And Tolkien and Dyson, but especially Tolkien, was able to convince him that Christianity was a myth. It was just a true myth. which has deep implications, right? Because what he means is that this type of cosmos, you mentioned your quantum physics, right? This type of cosmos is the sort of cosmos which is more like a myth than a machine. And that, I think, in some sense, gave Lewis permission to even to take theism and Christianity seriously.
Was there a moment of epiphany?
Again, I mean, Carpenter seems to think so, right? And it's seemingly when they were having this conversation where Tolkien impassionately says Christianity was a true myth. Supposedly, at that very moment, a great gust of wind in beautiful Magdalen College came and blew the leaves around as if a literal external inspiration was corresponding to the internal inspiration. Wow. And it was shortly after that Lewis said, okay, I'm going to give this theism thing a try. But then what he realized is that part of it for him, of course, he's so attentive to self-delusion that Lewis was very interested in how it's sadly true that so many of the ideas of our creed follow from choices that we previously made because we're, in love with some sort of, addicted to some sort of lower good. And so for Lewis, I think, that was the surprise about Christianity, that it was as much practice as it was just a sort of question of creed or arguments.
It's interesting using the word surprise or using the word epiphany. It's hard to tell whether they're that much apart. Did you have a moment of epiphany in your life?
That's another amazing question. I was just prepared to be a scholar and talk about Lewis. I think one of the fascinating things about being a modern is the difficulty in knowing if what you've had are indeed epiphanies or just a kind of emotional response. So I'd like to say yes. I did enter the Catholic Church when I was a senior at University of Dallas on Easter Saturday. Hold the Easter Vigil, and there were a series of things that for me led up to that. But I think that's one of the I don't want to take us from the Lewis book to another book that I've written.
I do this all the time. I'm a bookseller. I know I'm trying to sell your book, and then I steer you away from it. And afterwards, I feel like an idiot. You can go back if you want. You don't have to tell the whole story.
No, it's great. I mean, I wrote another book called An Introduction to Christian Mysticism, and in that book, I think my favorite chapter is chapter 1 about what I call the desert of modernity, and that in some sense, part of the desert of modernity is, well, in antiquity, right? A hermit would seek out these places, these deserted places, in order to achieve this kind of deep ascesis, which they thought was the necessary practical preparation for the illumination of the mind and the true love of God. However, Louis Dupree, a Belgian scholar, died a decade or two ago, argues that in some sense in modernity, the desert came to us. The desert is the sort of difficulty of the conditions of belief. So anyway, I sometimes think about that just in terms of, as you think about your own experience, as you think about your own journey of faith, it's difficult to evade the nagging voice, right? That the sort of nagging modern voice that would say that, well, look, this is just you being emotional. This is just you clinging to old beliefs. But I think that's also kind of the brilliance and kind of the excitement of being a person of faith in the desert of modernity. It's inherently a process of ascesis. We don't have to go anywhere.
Then, if you go back to Tolkien and Lewis, Tolkien despised the concept of allegory in Narnia. And then he despised Lewis attempting to pile onto the Lord of the Rings this allegorical aspect to it. So allegory, metaphor, fantasy, science fiction, all kind of go together in my head. And so is what Lewis did in Narnia, the allegory in Narnia, is it designed to be evangelical, if you will?
Yes and no. I think Lewis wanted to, I think on this one, I think he almost thinks of himself like a scientist, as an experimenter. And he takes some sort of basic ideas, some of which derive from Christianity, and he goes into his lab, and his lab is his book. And he creates this experiment, and he mixes these chemicals and says, what's going to happen? I don't think this is an unfaithful way to actually talk about his composition process. I mean, he says at one point that, he had been haunted by this image of this fawn with a parcel under its arm and an umbrella. That's it. He just had this image, and he didn't know what it was, and he didn't know where it belonged to, and he didn't have a plot for it. But so I think in some sense, you sort of take that and drop it and create a world for it and then see what happens. I think Lewis almost felt, again, like an experimenter, like a chemist who walks into his lab, and I guess he would know what he was doing, but like a student who walks into a chemist lab and just grabs some chemicals and puts them in a vat and mixes and say, is it going to turn purple? Is it going to explode? Is it just going to be inert? I think in some ways, Lewis does something like that. He creates worlds in which some basic ideas sort of take on flesh. But then as a faithful storyteller, if he's good, he doesn't force these ideas into certain ways, but he lets them sort of naturally develop. So the sort of patterns, like when it's cold outside and you breathe on a window and it creates this cool pattern of frost, right? I think that's what Lewis is doing when he writes a story. And for him, it's sort of confirmation that, all right, look, if Christianity is true in our world, is it true in this one? Breathes on it, and then this gorgeous crystalline pattern of frost emerges and thinks, oh my goodness, it is. So I think that he thinks that he's doing less forcing of the issue than like critical biographers would think, that he's trying to force kids to have become Christians. I think in a way he's just saying, what if I took it into this imaginary world? What would happen then?
Yeah,
and then it turns out like it is, and he is as impressed as anyone else.
I know, and I never really thought of it that way, but it's like in Screw Tape, which now seems to be like an experiment to me, because no one had ever done that. And when he says "Our Father below," and if a kid's reading that, wait a minute, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah, right.
All of a sudden, by turning something on its head, not only does it make you confused, but it also makes you realize that there are always two points of view.
Yeah, but he's also, in some sense, by trying to whatever extent, like I don't think he's just parodying or lampooning Screw Tape and Wormwood. No. But I think in some sense, by bringing his intellect to this world and trying to make it believable, reliable, and naturalistic. In other words, do it justice. Let it really be built out from its fundamental principles, and then see what it looks like. And as it turns out, hell is a lot like a modern, bureaucratic institution with a bunch of paper pushers and who have disdain for people who lack efficiency. And I think in a way, right, like that's sort of Lewis is trying to be, she's trying to be faithful to the basic principles, but as it starts almost kind of painting itself, then I think he thinks that then you can look at this secondary world, this mythopoeic, they love this word of mythopoeia, the creation of secondary worlds from kind of raw ingredients. But then you can say something really interesting about our world by virtue of the imaginary world you created. So I think they'd be very suspicious of the term fiction.
Yeah.
To quote my beloved Dante, another book I've written, even though I don't know that if that one's being sold today, but the Dante describes his own poem as a non-false error. A non-false error. I think Lewis would be very comfortable with that way of talking about his own fiction. Is it fiction? Depending on what you mean by it. Yeah, it's a non-false error.
Well, another experiment which I think sometimes must have been very painful for him, but assuaging to others is a grief observed. And like I said in the introduction, when someone dies and people go up and they go, "Is there anything I can do?" Yeah, you can bring my son back. You don't want a casserole. There's no reason to say, "How are you doing?" or anything. So all I do is I'll just lay the book on their desk, and it seems to work pretty well. And they always thank me. But there's the experiment. He's doing something no one else has ever done, and he's going through it while he's observing it. Is it called a grief portrayed in England? Or
I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either. But yeah, just you're right. I never, and then it reminds you that my love, Joyce. You look at Ulysses, which I'm looking at right now, and you realize it's exactly the same thing. This great experiment that started out simply as another short story that would end Dubliners, and then it became what it is today.
Yes.
Another Divine Comedy, another Odyssey.
Yes. Yeah, I think that aspect of Lewis creating worlds, Lewis, again, to go back to the metaphor, Lewis creating atmospheres. I think that's probably my favorite couple of pages of this book, of the Lewis book, is the sort of description of breathing Narnian air. He has this lovely line in which basically when the children are back in the world of Narnia and they breathed in enough air, their deep memory, their muscle memory comes back to them, their old strengths and their old knowledges. That, come to find out, is exactly how Lewis felt about the act of reading. And incidentally, he hated Three Musketeers because it didn't have any atmosphere. It didn't have any weather. And so I think what we should think of, and this I feel like I think this is maybe the central insight of the book, is that what we should realize is that if Lewis the scholar gives facts to his students so that then they can go breathe the atmosphere of whatever, Spencer or Wyatt or Romain de la Rose or Dante or Boethius, Lewis the fiction writer is taking those medieval ideas and then translating them into an atmosphere. And so in some sense, as I say at the beginning, Lewis was not successful as an apologist and as a fiction writer, despite his day job, but because of it. And when he saw that and started just translating these old ideas, it gave him a chance to practice the old form of medieval composition on the old ideas, updating them into a modern vocabulary. And in some sense, the medievals empowered him to engage in this process of imitatio, or literary recycling of a master.
You talk about that aura or the smell or the feel as you go through the back of the wardrobe and you're in this. It's so funny because a couple of weeks ago, we gave a friend of ours a box of Turkish Delight, and he wrote me a text saying, I remember a book I read where there was this bad kid and there was this queen, and it was like, oh, wow, I'm inside of it right now. Isn't that cool?
It's very cool. Yeah, that a taste could trigger, as you said earlier, dredge up an old memory. Yeah. Well, if you go to the C.S. Lewis house just outside of Oxford, they very suspiciously offer you Turkish delights as you enter.
Seriously?
Yeah.
I love Turkish Delight.
The thing, I'm keto.
Oh, show the cover of your book. So we can.
It's going to show it. Yep, reversed, isn't it? Yeah.
No, it's not. It's not.
Okay, good. Yeah. Reversed for me, not for you.
Yeah. So what I was going to say was, and I say it in every interview, people tell me, everybody says you can't judge a book by its cover, but every single person who comes into my bookstore judges every book by its cover, unless they know what they're looking for.
It's a gorgeous cover.
Beautiful. Yeah, I was going to ask you, did you design it? Did you vet it? Did they decide this is a great cover? How'd that work?
Well, I should say that when my wife saw it, she said, I'm going to buy that book just for its cover.
Exactly.
Thanks, honey. But no, I didn't design it. They just presented it. I mean, I couldn't do anything but vet it. It's just such a gloriously beautiful thing. I think I just stood in awe of it. I think that might be the coolest moment for me as being a writer, is when the book cover is revealed. Because in some sense, this thing which had just walked around with you for, for 5 years, and various forms of lectures to students and lectures to different audiences, and for me, ideas on the back of legal pads and envelopes, it gets into a text, but it's still so wordy, right? It's just a collection of words, and all of a sudden it's external now. It has an image, and then someone else made it for you, a team that you belong to. I always feel like that's the moment of surrender, that then you can actually just get excited about your book. You can just think, wow, what a cool book. I mean, I have those sort of moments. My students think I'm really narcissistic, but I have these moments when I reread passages from my book and I think, oh, wow, that's so beautiful. But for me, right, it's already not mine. It's already been surrendered to a community of friends and readers. And now I'm just standing in admiration of it as well. So I love that moment of getting to basically be having my authorial sort of personal, privatized possession of it removed. And then I can just kind of love it for what it is.
Yeah, it's like Lewis said, and like you and I were bantering today in our text, if you love your book and you love what you wrote, you can say it. It's okay. And if someone thinks you're a narcissist, then you're a narcissist. It doesn't make any difference. You're just
it's your narcissist. Again, there's no escape, is there? Yeah.
Like Lewis says, I have if you have a toothache, you can say I have a toothache, but it's hard to say your heart is broken, but you can say it.
Right.
You have license to say whatever you want. And it is a beautiful book, and it's a wonderful book. Yeah, we can end on that note, saying it's a wonderful book. It'll be released March 15th. I get these boxes and it says do not open till March 15th, but I have to say sometimes I do open them. I think it's illegal. And I put them in. I like to have the first one out on the table, but perhaps I shouldn't talk about that. But in any event, it'll be on the front table and in the window. And along with all of our other Lewis, which we're getting all the back stock now, and your other books as well. Oh,
I'm so grateful. Thank you. I can't wait to come to the shop and buy one.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. Thanks so much for doing this, and I really appreciate it. It's close to my heart, as you could tell. I certainly I'm a dilettante about it, but it warms the cockles of my heart to talk about C.S. Lewis.
Mine too, and I'm super grateful, and wish all of your listeners and readers the best.
Thanks. We'll talk again soon, I hope.
Okay, yeah, sounds fun.
See you, Jason.
Bye.